you for taking time out of your day today to attend this informational webinar about the State Housing Tax Credit Program and Contribution Fund. My name is Christy Mills, and I am the Program Manager for the program. We are recording this training today, and the recording and the slides will be posted to our website. Next slide, please. Here are some meeting logistics. We are using the GoToWebinar platform. Your line will be muted in order to get a clear recording. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar. You can either type your questions into the questions section or the chat box of the GoToWebinar toolbar at any time, or you can wait and ask questions during the question and answer session at the end. Next slide, please. At Minnesota Housing, we believe in our mission. Housing is the foundation for success, so we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance housing that is affordable. We offer products that support the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. Minnesota Housing also offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. Thank you for being part of our mission. Next slide, please. Here are the topics that we will cover in this webinar. It is important to note that we are currently in the program development phase of the project, so the information in this presentation is not final and is subject to change. Also, please note that Minnesota Housing cannot provide tax advice, and any tax questions should be directed to your tax advisor. Next slide, please. Let's start with background information about the program. Next slide. In 2022, the Minnesota Legislature established the Minnesota Housing Tax Credit Contribution Account. Minnesota Housing is branding this program as the State Housing Tax Credit Program and Contribution Fund to distinguish it as a state program and help avoid any confusion with the agency's existing federal housing tax credit programs. The authorizing legislation sunsets on December 31st, 2028. Next slide, please. The State Housing Tax Credit Program is a new way to help finance multifamily and single-family housing. Funding for this program is unique because there are no state or federal appropriations. The program is entirely funded with eligible Minnesota taxpayer contributions. Next slide, please. Each year, $9.9 million in state housing tax credits will be available annually for 6 years. Unused tax credits do not roll forward into the next year. Eligible taxpayers are defined in Minnesota State Statute 290.01.6 as any person or corporation subject to a tax imposed by this chapter, and also in Minnesota State Statute 297I.01 as any insurance company, association, surplus lines broker or insured, or any other person or entity required to pay any amount due under that chapter. Eligible taxpayers can annually contribute at least $1,000, but not more than $2 million to the contribution fund. With the contribution, the eligible taxpayer may choose to designate a specific qualified project to receive the funds or contribute to the general contribution pool. In return, the taxpayer receives a state tax credit certificate that equals 85% of the contribution, which the taxpayer may use to reduce their state tax obligation. The maximum aggregate amount of tax credits allowed to all eligible contributors is $9.9 million annually. Next slide, please. Taxpayers apply for tax credit certificates online. Some of the information the applicant will provide is the name and information of the taxpayer to receive the tax credit certificate, the amount of the contribution, and if they are designating a contribution to a qualified project or the general contribution pool. Minnesota Housing staff will review the information and send a signature page and payment instructions to the applicant. We are planning to accept funds electronically and by check. We will also submit the taxpayer information to the Minnesota Department of Revenue prior to issuing tax credit certificate. The Minnesota Department of Revenue will notify Minnesota Housing if any information is incorrect, at which point the taxpayer will be contacted to correct the information. If Minnesota Housing is not notified of issues, a tax credit certificate is issued to the taxpayer within 30 days. Contributions are irrevocable. If a qualified project that receives a designated contribution is ultimately not feasible, the contribution may be transferred to the general contribution pool. We expect tax credit certificates to be available on a first-come, first-served basis. In future years, we may reserve a portion of the available state housing tax credits for contributions to the general contribution pool to prevent a few large designated contributions from using all available state housing tax credits early in the year. Next slide, please. Next, we will discuss contribution types. Next slide. When taxpayers make a contribution, they will direct their contribution to the general contribution pool or designate their contribution for a qualified project. We will talk about designated contributions and qualified projects in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. Contributions that are made to the general contribution pool will fund projects that are selected through a request for proposals process. Funding in the general contribution pool is subject to set-asides that are single-family housing, 25% of the contribution, housing in a township or city with a population of 2,500 people or fewer, and that is located outside of the metro area, and that is 10% of contributions. And for housing for households earning 50% or less of area median income, 35% of contributions. If applications are not received that meet these criteria, the funding may be used for other eligible projects. Minnesota Housing may require a minimum amount to be in the contribution pool before an RFP is held. Next slide, please. In this example, 4 taxpayers contribute different amounts to the general contribution pool, totaling $1 million. The $1 million in contributions are subject to the set-asides that were just described. Next slide, please. Minnesota Housing will create a simplified RFP for the State Housing Tax Credit Program for projects that are eligible under the program. Minnesota Housing may use existing RFP timelines and processes to help make the distribution of state housing tax credit contribution funds more efficient. For example, the agency may use funding from the set-aside for single-family housing to fund eligible units in the single-family RFP, and funding from the set-aside for projects serving households with incomes less than 50% of AMI in the annual multifamily consolidated RFP. This is similar to how we use the Challenge Fund as a funding source for multiple RFPs. Next slide, please. As previously noted, eligible taxpayers can direct their contribution to a specific qualified project, which is referred to as a designated contribution to a qualified project. A qualified project is defined as a project that qualifies under the Minnesota Housing Tax Credit Contribution Account in Minnesota statutes. A qualified project is a specific project. As an example, funding for new housing in Duluth would not be eligible as a designated contribution for qualified project. A contribution to a specific housing project to be built in Duluth may be eligible for a designated contribution. Next slide, please. When the taxpayer makes the designated contribution, they will provide information about the designee that will receive the funds. These contributions are not added to the general contribution pool and are separate from the set-asides. The agency will establish requirements and a time frame for designees to request the designated funds. When the agency receives a designated contribution, staff will notify the designee and provide instructions on how to access the funds. Minnesota Housing will hold these funds for a predetermined period, allowing the designee to finalize the remaining financing and schedule the closing. The designee will request the designated funds from Minnesota Housing. We will design a request process, which will include collecting information to confirm that the project qualifies for funding under the program, and confirmation that the designee is eligible to receive the funds and is not a disqualified individual or a disqualified business. If the project does not close within a predetermined timeframe or is otherwise infeasible, Minnesota Housing may add the funds to the general contribution pool and award them to other eligible projects. Once the funding request procedure is complete, the project will be funded in the form of a loan. Next slide, please. Next, we will cover program requirements, funding terms, and compliance. Next slide, please. Eligible recipients include cities, federally recognized tribes, tribal housing corporations, private developers, nonprofit organizations, HRAs, public housing authorities, and the owner of the housing. Next slide, please. Minnesota statutes defines a disqualified individual and a disqualified business. A disqualified individual is an individual who made a contribution to the account in the current or prior taxable year and received a credit certificate, or owns the housing for which the grant or loan will be used and is using that housing as their domicile, or meet these criteria. The individual is an officer or principal of a business entity, and that business entity made a contribution to the account in the current or previous taxable year and received a credit certificate, or meets these following criteria. The individual owns, controls, or holds the power to vote 20% or more of the outstanding securities of a business entity, and the business entity made a contribution to the account in the current or previous taxable year and received a credit certificate. Next slide, please. A disqualified business is a business entity that made a contribution to the account in the current or prior taxable year and received a tax credit certificate, or has an officer or principal who is an individual who made a contribution to the account in the current or previous taxable year and received a tax credit certificate, or meets the following criteria. The business entity is owned, controlled, or is subject to the power to vote 20% or more of the outstanding securities by an individual or business entity, and the controlling individual or business entity made a contribution to the account in the current or previous taxable year and received a tax credit certificate. Next slide, please. The statute further provides information that the disqualifications apply if the taxpayer would be disqualified either individually or in combination with one or more members of the taxpayer's family. Next slide, please. Contributions will be used to provide funding for loans for eligible multifamily and single-family housing projects in communities throughout the state. Eligible uses of funds include gap financing, new construction, acquisition, rehabilitation, demolition or removal of existing structures, construction financing, permanent financing, interest rate reduction, and refinancing. The funds must be used to serve households at 80% of area median income for rental housing projects and 115% of AMI for home ownership projects, except for the set aside for housing for households whose income is 50% of AMI or below. Next slide, please. We are proposing to provide funds as a loan. We expect awards and distributions to be generally provided in the form of a 0% or a low interest loan with up to a 30-year term. The loan term and interest rate may be adjusted to allow these funds to be utilized with other sources of funding. Loans may be deferred and loans may be forgivable. The authorizing statute requires that households must not have incomes at time of initial occupancy that exceeds the income limits that we just covered on the previous slide. To comply, all funds that are issued under this program will have compliance and monitoring requirements for the term of the loan. Next slide, please. Next, we will discuss the proposed program development timeline and RFP timeline. public comment period opened recently on July 28th. After receiving public input, we will finalize program policies and bring the program to the Minnesota Housing Board of Directors for approval in late summer and early fall, and begin accepting contributions for tax credit certificates. In January 2024, another $9.9 million in state housing tax credits will be available. Minnesota Housing may reserve a portion of the available state housing tax credits for contributions to the general contribution pool. We plan to issue an RFP in the spring, with RFP applications due in July for funds in the general contribution pool. If no applications are received that qualify for the set-aside funding, the agency may use that funding for other eligible projects. We will present selections to the Minnesota Housing Board of Directors with the annual consolidated RFP selection recommendations. Next slide, please. So that wraps up the overview of the program concepts. Next slide, please. Before we start the open discussion, I just want to quickly remind everyone that the public comment period is open and we want your feedback. There's also a program concept document available on the website that contains the information presented in this webinar. I know I've also just given you a whole lot of information, and so you might think of questions after this webinar. So please feel free to reach out. I'll have my contact information on one of the following slides. And then for public comment, if you could please use these two avenues listed on this slide. Next slide, please. All right, so as a reminder, the program is still in development, and everything that I just discussed in this webinar are subject to change, and we may not have answers to all of your questions yet. Another reminder that Minnesota Housing cannot provide tax advice. So we will now take your questions. Please type questions into the questions box or raise your hand and we will call on you. You will need to unmute your line and we will unmute you on our end. I also have a few topic starters on the slide, but please feel free to bring up whatever topic you have comments or questions about. And I will give everyone maybe a minute or two if you want to type in those questions.
I see we do have a couple of questions coming in.
Yeah.
You want to look at the questions box and you can start sifting through those. Oh yeah, they're coming in now.
Yeah, they're just coming in. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so first question. Can a request be made that contributions be designated for a geographic area? So the answer to that is no. A geographic area is not a qualified project. So it could go to the general contribution pool and they would be used statewide. Or if there's a project in a certain geographic area that you know is currently in process, you could possibly contribute to that project.
Chrissy, we have an attendee that would like to speak to the audience. David, feel free. I've unmuted your line. Go ahead and unmute your line.
Hi, I just had a question regarding the disqualified individuals. So if just say hypothetically there's a project that's been submitted and maybe it's a partnership between 5 individuals that each own 20%. Based on this presentation, my understanding is that if they were to designate some funds to this program, they would all be disqualified if they were involved in the development of the project. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think so. So what you're saying is if an owner or a partner wanted to contribute funds to a project that they have an ownership interest in, is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, correct. So reading that, it looks like they would not be eligible.
And is that because of the 20% rule, or is it if they have any ownership whatsoever?
I would have to go back and relook at that slide.
Okay.
So is that maybe something we could follow up with offline, since it sounds like you have some pretty specific parameters you want to ask about?
That'd be great.
Great. Thank you. I think we'll have a lot of questions and clarifications around disqualified individuals and businesses. So thank you for bringing that up. And then just a question for our ops folks. I'm not able to see the person who just asked that question. So if we could jot his name down so we could get back in touch, that would be great.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go back to the list here. It looks like we have about 10 questions. That's great. Thank you, everyone. So the next one is, what were the terms of the fund during the program requirements you mentioned? Let me flip through my slides. I'm not sure if I know exactly what the question is, but let me go back up to my slides. Or Patricia, that was your question, if you wanted to maybe expand upon that for me. And you can do that in the chat if you don't want to come on and speak. And then I will pop down to the next question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you have a slide you want me to display, feel free to just pop it out and I'll grab it for you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm understanding her question entirely. So I'm hoping that she can, oh, here, I see it. On the slide of the program requirements, you mentioned some numbers. Okay, so let's go back up to the program requirements slide. Let's go to slide 22, Patty. And see if this is what we're looking for. So were you looking for the income limit? Or any of the information on this slide?
Patricia, I've unmuted your line if you'd like to pop in.
0%.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was taking down notes and I just heard you say something about something being like zero interest for a certain amount of time. And I was like trying to quickly take it down, but then, so I got these notes.
Oh, sure.
But you were saying something that wasn't on the screen. Sorry, yeah.
Sure, no problem. So I think, Patty, we're talking about slide 23, the funding terms and compliance.
Oh.
So we're proposing to provide funds as a loan, and we don't have a, defined where every single loan is going to have these terms. So what we were saying was that we expect they're going to be generally provided in the form of a 0% or low interest loan up to a 30-year term, but the loan term and the interest rate may be adjusted to allow the funds to be utilized with other sources of funding, and that the loans may be deferred and that they may be forgivable.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the clarification.
No problem. Sorry I didn't understand your question right away, but I'm glad you got there.
The slide. Thank you.
All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to hop on to the next question in our questions box. So you said the RFP will be separate from the consolidated RFP process, but will follow a similar timeline. I'd stress keeping the RFP as simplified as possible if separate. Thank you for that feedback. Yes, we do expect that folks will be able to apply for funding directly from the State Housing Tax Credit Program, and just possibly using some of that set-aside funding if we don't have applications for that funding to fund projects in other RFPs that would be eligible. So hopefully that makes sense.
Christy,
If the funds are used as, yeah.
Hi, this is Summer Jefferson, and I'm the programs manager at Minnesota Housing. I just wanted to also add that I think Chrissy mentioned this, but I think, yes, if you are requesting the state housing tax credit funds only, yes, it'll be a separate RFP, and we will be definitely looking to make that a simple application process. But if they are kind of in conjunction with the single family consolidated RFP or the multifamily consolidated RFP, then the process would align with those RFPs, if that makes sense. So the application process would be the same as what you would do if you're asking for additional funding from Minnesota Housing above and beyond the state housing tax credits. Then it would be a separate process and you'd follow that application process. So I just wanted to
thank you for popping in. Okay, the next question I have up, it says, if the funds are used as a loan, what happens to the funds that are repaid? So I'm sure you guys love it when I read statute to you. So in the statute, what it says is that any amount of a loan that is repaid or recaptured must be redeposited in the account and is not returned to the taxpayer who made the contribution. So those funds would be returned and I would assume reused for other development.
We have a question. An attendee wants to answer or ask a question of the panelists. So we've got Sue Watler-Phillips. Unmuted your line. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask her question.
Thanks so much, and thanks for doing this webinar. Sue Watler-Phillips from MICA, the Metropolitan Interfaith Council on Affordable Housing. In regards to the income eligibilities or the limits at 115% of home ownership and 80% for renters, is that something that we can comment on and say that we want to see a percentage, like 50% going at 30% and below for rental, and that 50% would go towards homeowners at 50% of median income and below? Is that something that is something that you could take comments on?
I would think so. I might defer to Summer, who has been through this public comment period before. I will just mention too that came from the statute. So that's just, what the requirements at least have to be. If that
right, I understand it needs to be looked at, but can we prioritize these funds specifically for people with more limited incomes in both home ownership and in rentals? What I'm asking, if we can comment on that area.
Oh, okay, so you're suggesting that maybe those income limits should be lower or prioritized for lower income
funding a project that would meet those income levels. So I guess I'm looking for a prioritization, and that Micah would be making a comment saying that we'd want to see at least half of those dollars prioritized for people with the lowest incomes, under 30% for rental, and at least under 50% and probably under 30% for home ownership too, especially if we can get forgivable loans for people that are getting into home ownership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
And Summer, were you popping in on that?
Yeah, we can definitely, if you have any comments about, I just want to point out, I know that the statute already has some set-asides for incomes at 50%. So just kind of incorporate that into your comments as well, or any percentages that you think should be, but you can comment that you think we should further restrict additional funds to lower income, single family or multifamily uses. So feel free to incorporate that into your comment.
Thank you. I think that since we're providing such a great tax credit for folks that are donating resources in this way, is that it makes sense that we are helping those with the least in our community. Thank you for letting me ask the question.
Thank you. Okay, the next question I have up is, if a specific project is funded through tax credits, how long must the project remain in compliance with the AMI requirements? I guess I have a question on your question. When you say funded through tax credits, do you mean federal tax credits or just the state housing tax credits through this program? I'm going to answer it as though it's the state housing tax credits. And so we haven't written the full compliance section yet, but I would expect that the project would remain in compliance for the length of the loan term.
Serena, I've muted that, or I've unmuted if you want to pop in there.
It was for the state tax credit program. That was the question. Okay. But the term of the loan, do you know what are the options for the terms of the loan?
So we don't have defined. It will be a 10-year deferred forgivable loan. It will be kind of flexible based on some of the other types of funding that are in the deal.
I mean, I just want to, our thought is that particularly for rental housing is that, you know, a deferred loan most likely would, most lenders, like if you don't have any other funding, deferred funding sources, like a lender is going to want the funding to at least be coterminous with the first mortgage. Right. We are going to have additional conversations whether or not that would be, you know, we would allow like smaller than 30 years. Our inclination, I guess, generally is that we want the maximum amount of affordability so that we can ensure longer term affordability for the funds. But if there are any comments or that you'd like to add or your thoughts as far as like how it could work with a project that you're considering and different other funding sources that you're looking at, then that please comment and let us know your thoughts. Does that help?
It does help. It's more so just preparing because I know there's going to be questions from our city and county on that. So, okay.
Thank you for that question, and thank you, Summer, for that other information. So next one, terms of loans, and what will the specific compliance requirement be? So I think we just talked a little bit about the terms of loans, and there's kind of TBD, and the specific compliance requirements. So we don't have the compliance requirements section written yet. In the statute, it does state that initial occupancy, that at the time of initial occupancy, the household must meet those income requirements. So we will need to have compliance and monitoring for that. And then I don't know yet if there will be other compliance and monitoring requirements that we just as an agency are required to do. Do you anticipate requiring prevailing wages for projects? That is a great question. And yes, it is my understanding that prevailing wages will apply. Okay, will project-specific contributions be awarded on a rolling basis as the contributions are made? For example, project-specific contributions would not be part of the RFP. Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, it's just basically that they will be, that someone could make a project-specific contribution at any time and that people would be able to request the distribution for those at any time and would not be a part of the annual RFP process. And that is correct. They will be, you can request those throughout the year. If there's a designated contribution for a project, the designee can request that throughout the year. They don't have to wait until the RFP period. And then Patty, would we be able to just flip down to that last slide that had some of those, that had the talking points on them, just so we can have that in the background? Thank you. Okay, recognizing that projects may take years to evolve, At what point is the project eligible for designation? Relatedly, how long will MHFA hold credits for a designated project? So we haven't firmed up the timeline, like we will hold it for X amount of months, but I think the number we're kind of coalescing around seems to be about 18 months. So from the time that the contribution is made to the time that the contribution is requested. So we would have around 18 months with which that would need to happen. So the project would need to be, you know, further than just conceptual. It would need to be a project that is moving forward. So it could get, the funds could be requested within that amount of time. If a project is designated, but not yet fully funded, how long will that project have to get completed and utilize that designated portion? So I think this is similar to the previous question. We haven't finalized that time frame yet, but 18 months seems to be what we've been floating around, but I'm curious to find out if anyone else has any thoughts or any feedback on that.
And Chrissy, I just want to be, I know there'll be a lot of interest in the designated contributions, and so we are thinking about 18 months and thinking about it, tying it to the loan closing and not necessarily the actual distribution of the funds. I just want to be clear about what we're thinking so that people can comment on those pieces if there's any particular unintended consequences with using those. And the idea, I know there's probably a lot of people who are thinking about how this will translate to the RFP, the multifamily consolidated RFP and projects. So I think we've thought through, you know, a project could potentially have an investment from someone that could be counted in the consolidated RFP. And then once the project is closer to closing, those dollars could potentially come in to the state housing tax credit as a designated project or designation from that investor. And then essentially the project would have 18 months to actually close, and then the state housing tax credit funds would be one of the loans that would be at closing. And so then they would meet the requirement and receive the funds via the disbursement process. So hopefully that gives a little bit of the background process thinking that we're using so that you guys have a little bit more to comment on.
Yeah. That was great info. Thanks for adding that, Summer. Okay, so the next question, can a designated entity decline a state housing tax credit contribution? Yeah, I think so. If for some reason it wouldn't work with their funding, that could be declined. Now just keep in mind that the contributions are irrevocable. So if that were to happen, what we would do with those funds is add them to the general contribution pool, and they would be used to fund other projects throughout the state, or those funds would be used to fund other projects. Related to the geographic area question, is that how Minnesota Housing is proposing, or is that outlined in the statute? So to clarify, I think what you're asking is a qualified project defined in the statute as not being a geographic area, or is that how Minnesota Housing is defining it? So I'm losing my words. A qualified project is a project that is eligible under the statute. And so when we worked with our legal team, we determined that a geographic area is not a qualified project, and therefore we would not be able to use that as a designation. Next question, can you make the slides be available? I'm not understanding the reasoning between the disqualified taxpayers. It sounds like taxpayers can only contribute once in a lifetime to the pool. Is that right? So first question, yes, the slides will be available. I think they're actually available right now as a handout if you look over on the GoToWebinar control panel. And then we're also going to publish them on the web along with this presentation. So the second part about how many times a taxpayer can contribute, they could contribute multiple times to the pool, but there are just limitations on the amount that they can contribute annually. So an individual could contribute in 1 year a certain amount up to $2 million, and they could contribute in the next year whatever amount up to $2 million. All right, next question. It seems the RFP period in 2024 will coincide with the Minnesota federal tax credit application deadline. Is it the intent that applications can and will be reviewed through one application process? So yes, the intent is that it will follow the consolidated RFP process for the single family and the multifamily RFP. They will be reviewed separately. It will be, different folks doing the review, but we're trying to follow that same timeline. So if any of the set-asides are used to fund the single-family RFP or the multifamily RFP, the timing works out and we can present all of those at the same time to our board of directors. If the developer of a project is not an owner of the project, but they will be receiving a development fee for their services, would they be considered a disqualified individual? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that today. So that's one that we'll take away and do some research on and then come back with an answer. Could you define eligible taxpayers that can contribute? Yes, that's more of the fun statute reading. There are two parts in statute that allow or that define an eligible taxpayer. Let me see if I can pop that back up. Okay, so eligible taxpayers are defined in Minnesota state statute in 290.01.06 as any person or corporation subject to a tax imposed by that chapter, and also in Minnesota state statute 297I.01 as any insurance company, association, surplus lines broker, or insured, or any other person or entity required to pay any amount due under this chapter. And that information is also included in the statute that we have linked in the program concept. Do HRAs or cities qualify as business entities? Are employees of those public entities' governments considered disqualifying from contributing or designating to the state housing tax credit? That's another great question that I don't know the answer to right now. So that's one that we'll take down and do some further research and get some information back out on that. Thank you for that. Will funds be made available through this program? Will funds made available through this program be available to low-income families only as loans? Or will some of the funds be made available to be given out as grants? I asked because I'd like to contribute to funds that would be given out as a grant to a low-income family, given the critical need for more truly affordable housing. So the funds won't be going to like an individual homeowner or an individual renter. They will be going to cities, HRAs, We had that whole slide of them, and I can't remember them all off the top of my head right now. But they'll be going to entities. They won't be going to individual renters or individual homeowners. So it would only be, the loan agreement would be for between Minnesota Housing and the recipient.
Christy,
hopefully that answers your question.
Can you say a little bit more about how it works for home ownership when we provide the funds, like affordability gap, value gap? Inevitably that does translate to more affordability for the actual homeowner.
So are you sorry, just let me clarify. So are you asking if a entity is awarded funds that they are going to then award out to individuals, like for affordability gap?
Yeah, so I just want to make
purchase a home?
our funds generally go to developers or cities or counties, but inevitably the end user does benefit from the funding. So I know Joe was saying that he wanted the funds to be available to low-income families. Inevitably giving them to the developer as value gap for the project helps to either rehab the project for a low-income family, or affordability gap helps to reduce the mortgage for a family so that it is more affordable. So that's one way that I know through single family, through their RFP, that they use the funds. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to stress that even though we're not giving them directly to the family, that it will make them more affordable to a family, if that makes sense. So
okay, so it sounds like maybe we need some clarifications around
contribute, right? But
so it sounds like maybe we need some clarifications around how this would work with single family projects that are eligible under the single family RFP. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I think some of the initial thoughts were that the funding that is used, that the set aside funding that could possibly be used in the single family RFP could be used as construction financing. That might free up some other resources that they would use for other things. And then I don't recall off the top of my head, but there was another use that they could use loans for through the single family RFP. So it sounds like we could be a little more clear on how we anticipate that working. Okay, so the next question is just a logistics one. Is there a link to the presentation PowerPoint, as I missed the first 15 minutes? Yep, we'll get this all posted to the web so you can go out and review. And then I think we'll have the Q&A out there as well.
And it is, the PowerPoint is actually listed in the handouts in your go-to menu bar.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question. So project sponsors who apply to the RFP are not incentivized to invest in these credits because they would become a disqualified individual. So I might ask Summer to pop on a little bit to help out with this one regarding the project sponsor questions, if you're able.
I believe, Chrissy, based upon who are disqualified, is that you cannot be, and you can correct me, Chrissy, if I'm wrong, is that yes, a project sponsor or owner of a rental project cannot be an investor or a tax or receive a tax credit contribution, or they would be deemed as a disqualified individual, right? Is that?
Yeah, if they're an owner.
If they're an owner.
That's true.
So an owner cannot make cannot make a contribution and designate it to their own project.
Right.
According to the statute.
Right. Thank you for adding that. All right. So I just want to point out we have about 7 minutes left, and we still have a bunch of questions to go through. So I'm going to keep going through these questions, but if we don't get to all of them, we'll put together a summary and get that out to folks. So we'll still address those questions. The next question is, are contributions deductible federally? So this is a question that I reached out to our own Department of Revenue about. And to clarify, I think what you're asking is you get the 85% tax credit from your state taxes, but then there's that remaining 15%. And is that possibly deductible? And so I don't have the exact language from Department of Revenue, but I think basically what it came to is that that's something you would have to check with the IRS with your tax situation and to see if that would be eligible on your federal return. Is this program being based on a similar one being done in another state? I was really happy to see this innovative opportunity. So yes, from what I know is that this is actually based on a program that they have in North Dakota, or that they had. I'm not sure if it's still currently funded in North Dakota, but it's based on their program. And then Minnesota has its own kind of variations to the program. Will there be a separate state housing credits RFP for 2023 for projects that are only requesting state credits, not part of the super RFP? So we don't expect to have an RFP in 2023, but any contributions made in 2023 to the general contribution pool will be added to the pool that we will use for the 2024 state housing tax credit RFP. Okay, let's see, we have somebody with a lot of numbers in the next one. You mentioned a $2 million limitation on the amount of contribution allowed. Does the $2 million contribution limit apply, 1, to each contribution, or 2, is that the aggregate amount of contributions allowed from a particular contributor each year? So $2 million is the maximum that an individual contributor can contribute each year. So they would not be able to make 3 $2 million contributions in the same year. They can only go up to $2 million. When does the investor take the credit? Is it in the year in which the investment is made, or the year the project is completed, or some other time frame? In the statute, it says that the tax credit must be taken in the same year that the contribution is made. I would also advise any of those questions to take a look at the statute. There's some carry forward information that I don't have memorized, but you should take a look at that to get further information. Will a donor only be allowed to make a contribution once, or can they make a contribution every year through 2028? The information that we have is that they will be able to contribute in multiple years. They just can't exceed that $2 million amount every year. Okay, would 100% of a project need to meet the 50% AMI test to access the 50% set aside, or could you have a portion of the building meeting 50% AMI? So my understanding right now is that the entire project would need to meet that 50% AMI requirement. That's something we'll further discuss and confirm with our legal team, and we'll have that information available. Will the state tax credits be compatible with a workforce housing project as eligible match funds? I might ask Summer to jump in on this one too. One thing to note is that the workforce housing does not have income limit requirements, and this program does. So they may not mesh in that way. But Summer, are there any other details you might want to add to that?
I mean, I think we would, I mean, I think the idea was that they would potentially be able to work together, but we'd have to have, it's a good question, and it's something that we should connect with just to make sure that we are in line with the workforce statutes and requirements to make sure that we could do that. But I think it's a good question, and we'll look into that. We definitely want to be flexible, understanding that workforce projects would actually work with these funds as well.
Okay, I think I have time to do one more. It says eligible recipients also says owner of the housing. So that is not referring to an individual homeowner. So in the disqualified individual section, it does state that the owner of the housing cannot, like, it cannot be their domicile. Let's see if I can pop that back up. So a disqualified individual means an individual who owns the housing for which the grant or loan will be used and is using that housing as their domicile. So someone would not be able to apply to get funding for a building in which they live. Okay. We still have more questions, but we have run out of time, unfortunately, so I will work on getting those questions answered. If we can go to the next slide, please, Patty. So this is my contact information if you have program-specific questions. If you have public comment, though, I would appreciate it if you could please send it to that email address that was on the previous slides. It's also in your e-news, and it's also on our website. That way we have the public comments coming in to the same place, and it doesn't end up in my email inbox. So thank you again, everyone, for listening to this webinar. And you guys had a lot of really great questions and a lot of things for us to consider as we continue making decisions on this program. So thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.